Tales from the Old Forest. Written and read for you by Jon Buckeridge. Chapter 3. Compassion on its feet.
"Morning!"
came a bubbling voice from the other side of the door, jerking Plentyn from his sleep.
"There's tea on the stove and eggs in the pan. Now stir your idle bones, for I have plans for the day."
Plentyn opened his bleary eyes, blinking fretfully and trying to get his bearings. As he swiped the sleep from his eyes and hauled himself from horizontal to perpendicular, the memories of the night before returned to him. After all the excitement by the fireside, Plentyn, Grandma and the squirrel had sat a while longer until it burned out, and then spread the ashes and doused them fully before setting off home, Plentyn's new friend riding nimbly on his shoulder. The forest had been pitch black, the thick canopy extinguishing all but the most determined starlight. This hadn't seemed to bother Grandma, though. Without breaking stride, she raised her cupped palm before her and sang out a long, low note of song. Or perhaps it wasn't song. It certainly wasn't a word, or at least not one that Plentyn knew. But there was a sense of music to it nonetheless. At first, nothing had seemed to happen. But then Plentyn had seen them. First there was just one. A slow, glowing mote drifting through the darkness towards them. It looked for all the world like a spark from a fire, and for a moment Plentyn worried they hadn't doused the fire properly, but as it got closer, he realized the colour was wrong. Not the amber glow of fire, but a brighter, yellow-green light pulsing slowly in the night. It had drifted softly to Grandma, settling in the very centre of her palm, illuminating her face with its gentle light. Plentyn had just been about to ask what it was when another greenish glow drifted past his eyeline, then another and another. As he had looked up, he saw dozens, hundreds of the small sparks streaming towards Grandma and settling in her palm. It was such a beautiful sight that Plentyn felt his breath catch in his throat. As each one landed, the glow on Grandma's face grew, and Plentyn had seen that she was grinning broadly. "You are magic," he'd whispered. He hadn't meant to say it to her exactly. It was more of a statement that had bubbled up from within him and straight out of his mouth without his brain ever really being involved. But she'd replied anyway.
"Nonsense, I've no more magic in me than a tree branch."
She continued to smile down at the glowing shapes resting on her palm.
"It's these fireflies that hold the true magic."
With that, she held her hand above her, casting enough light to guide them on.
"Come now,"
she'd begun and taken a step forward, when a thought leapt to Plentyn's mind.
"You always say trees are magical,"
he'd interrupted her.
"Excuse me?"
the old woman had asked, looking momentarily off-kilter.
"Just now you said there was no more magic in you than a tree branch, but you always tell me that trees are the most magical beings in the forest."
He hadn't quite known how to end his thought. It wasn't really a question, and it certainly wasn't an accusation, but Plentyn realised it could have been taken as either. Grandma, however, had deployed battle-class powers of deflection, as all grandmas can, and brushed it aside.
"Did I now?" she'd said, striding ahead. "Keep up there."
It was a dark night, despite the firefly glow, but Plentyn was sure he'd seen Grandma's smile quirk up on one side of her satisfied smirk, and so he'd followed on behind, knowing there would be no further answers tonight. All the while, as they'd walked, they'd spoken with the squirrel, trying to get more of a sense of her. Plentyn had asked her name, which only seemed polite, but the small creature seemed a little confused by the concept.
"Name?"
she'd sent.
"What is name?"
"It's what you call a thing," Plentyn had tried to explain.
"Like, this is a tree."
He'd gestured to a nearby tree trunk, but the squirrel had shaken her head.
"This no tree,"
she had sent.
"This oak home, oak food, oak safety, oak shelter."
Plentyn had been fascinated. It was different, but it also made a perfect sense to him. Nonetheless, he couldn't just call his friend Squirrel, so he tried again.
"But what's your name?
Like, I'm Plentyn." He tapped himself on his chest, then gestured to the illuminated form of Grandma.
"This is Grandma." "This not Grandma,"
the squirrel had sent, looking at the striding figure in front of him.
"It certainly is," Plentyn had replied.
"That ain't how they know me, lad. I keep telling you, I have names enough to fill 3 barrels.
"Wait," Plentyn had said, confused. "So all the creatures know you by different names?"
"Most of them," she'd said with a shrug.
"What do they—"
Plentyn had begun, then realised he was addressing the wrong person and turned his attention back to the squirrel.
"What do you call her?"
he'd asked, gesturing towards Grandma.
"Never you mind about my name," Grandma had interrupted. "I believe you were asking her name. Try asking how she is called. Not all creatures think of names in the same way that we do, but they do call one another."
This had seemed wise, and Plentyn had already seen the squirrel's head start to bob in affirmation before he even finished the question.
"Red fur loves branch, flies lightly," she'd sent back, nodding and bobbing her head all the while. Again, it was different, but it made perfect sense. "It is lovely to meet you," he'd said. "That's a lovely name, though it is a little long. Might it be all right if I called you Red for short?"
There had been a pause at this, and Plentyn had got the impression the squirrel was trying to compute a whole new concept, or else had been intolerably rude. He'd just been ready to try and explain further, or else apologise for the insult, when the squirrel nodded again.
"To you, I called Red."
And that had been that. Grandma, Plentyn, and Red had traipsed through the forest together, lit by the flickering lights in Grandma's palm, and talking back and forth. Plentyn wasn't sure what time he'd finally gone to sleep, but there were birds beginning their pre-dawn chorus, and Red was curled up neatly on his pillow, her back legs twitching slightly in her sleep. In the light of morning, as he looked down, Red was still there, sleeping soundly. Her little mouth was slightly open, but her bushy tail had flicked up across her eyes to keep the light out. Moving as delicately as his sleep-fuzzed mind would allow so as not to wake her, Plentyn crept out of his room and shut the door softly behind him. Padding across the wooden planks of the hallway, Plentyn could smell that the promised eggs were almost done, and the warm aroma of fresh bread graced the air all around him. Grandma was nowhere to be seen, but he could hear her singing softly in one of the other rooms, so Plentyn set about helping himself to breakfast. After a moment he had a brief thought and reached into a nearby bowl, placing some nuts on the kitchen bench for whenever Red woke up to join him. At this point, while Plentyn makes himself breakfast and sets to it with the passion only one who faced near death the day before can muster, it makes sense that we pull back from this idyllic scene while I answer the question several of you are probably thinking at this very moment. Where do Plentyn and Grandma live? Well, when Plentyn had first come across Grandma some time ago, he was at his lowest and saddest ebb, lonely, hungry, desperate, grieving, and utterly afraid. In the face of that, Grandma had been a warm ray of sunshine on a cloudy day or a soft blanket in the cold, and Plentyn had fallen into her arms. As she'd led him away, though, a small thought had prickled in the back of his mind. 1,000 fairy tales of mysterious old women in the woods, luring children to their perfect home, and the dark consequences that followed ran through Plentyn's mind. Was he just the next victim in a long line of unhappy children that led to their deaths in a picturesque woodland cottage? Well, as we all know, that is not what happened. Take that, patriarchal interpretations of women who live alone. And nor did Grandma live in a cottage. Grandma lived in a treehouse. Now, take whatever first image you had when you heard the word treehouse and set it aside. It's nothing quite like that. This wasn't a ramshackle wooden structure of rough planks nailed to a tree trunk. Grandma's house had been grown by the tree itself. Plentyn didn't know what the tree was, and he'd never thought to ask, and I can tell you that no tree exists like it anywhere outside of the old forest, so there's no sense in searching for it. A single vast trunk grew high into the air and then opened up into a huge, flat canopy of 8 branches that formed a platform in a wide octagon several meters across. Then they shot straight up again, 8 pillars framing flawless views through the forest, before closing in over the top of the octagon to form a perfect roof. Here, the branches sent offshoots and twigs populated with wide, flat leaves in a living thatch. Over the years, Grandma had clearly added to the place. Planks taken from a fallen tree made beautiful flooring, Willow branches and hazel rods woven into lattices divided the space and made rooms. Plants and vines grew all throughout the place, making it colourful and vibrant. From somewhere, not even I know where, Grandma had salvaged a small but serviceable wood stove, and so her treehouse was warm and cosy. It was a small home, but big enough for her and Plentyn to live more than comfortably, and Plentyn loved it. "I see you're up and about, lad," said Grandma, bustling back into the kitchen space. "Excellent. I was thinking about our chat from last night, and I've plans afoot."
"Which chat was that, Grandma?" Plentyn had asked. "We had quite a few."
"Kindness, lad. The one about kindness. It strikes me," she began as she bustled around the kitchen with that seamless efficiency all grandmas seem to possess, "that your parents must have been big on kindness, for you to have it so built into you that you'll dive into a river for a stranger. So it may be a good place to start if we want to unlock a few more of those memories you've got buried deep inside you." "So we'll go around the forest looking for kind people?" Plentyn asked through a mouthful of his breakfast. "People ain't exactly in steady supply in this forest, lad, in case you hadn't noticed," Grandma corrected him. "We'll be looking for creatures what show it, and don't talk with your mouth full."
"But animals can't be kind, can they?" Plentyn replied after he'd swallowed his next bite. "That's a human thing, surely."
Grandma turned on him so quickly he almost jumped back in shock. "Don't you ever suggest that creatures ain't got kindness in them, my boy. There's naught in this world worth doing that can't be done by animals, and there's plenty out there done by humans that no animal would ever dream of." She saw Plentyn had properly received the point, and her tone became less serious. "Think about your friend Red in there," she motioned to the closed door. "You think the gift she gave you was anything less than kindness? Why, that may be her favourite seed stock, or the acorn she was saving special. It may even be the last of her winter stores, and she just so decided that you needed it because you'd exerted yourself on her behalf. Now I calls that kindness, don't you?" Plentyn hadn't thought about it in those terms. He knew it was a gift, and he knew it was the squirrel's way of saying thank you, but he'd never considered that Red, in her own way, was trying to feed him because he must have been hungry.
"I suppose you're right," he agreed, the truth dawning as he said it.
"Of course I am," Grandma agreed. "And I'm right about this plan, too. Just you mark my words. If we go in search of kindness in the forest, we'll find a great deal more besides. A great deal more." She emphasized the last few words, weighting each one of them carefully, and Plentyn could see that she was quite excited by the idea. "Now go and get yourself dressed and ready, and pack a bag for an adventure," Grandma commanded. He shoved the last pieces of his breakfast in his mouth and hopped down from the stool he was sitting at, making for his room.
"Okay, I'll grab some things. Red could come with us, right?" he asked through his food.
"I'd imagine we couldn't stop her if we tried. The forest is hers even more than it's ours, I reckon," said Grandma. "And don't speak with your mouth full."
"She's pretty flat out at the moment, though," Plentyn pointed out, swallowing like a gannet.
"Well, of course she is," Grandma enthused. "She's a diurnal creature, and we kept her awake at all hours. Poor wee thing's probably quite exhausted. Never you mind, though, she'll soon perk up. I ain't never met a squirrel as slept in past noon, and I don't imagine as I shall. You just get ready while I pack some food. I'm sure Red will be along shortly."
Sure enough, by the time Plentyn was washed and dressed, he returned to his room to find Red up and alert. She was perched on top of Plentyn's bedpost, grooming her fur self-consciously. "Adventure?" she asked as Plentyn entered. "Adventure," Plentyn confirmed. "We're going off into the forest to find other creatures. Will you come with us?" He picked up his favourite red jumper, knitted for him by Grandma. It had a deep hood and a few pockets that were excellent for holding interesting rocks and shells and seeds he found on his travels. "Foodstuffs?" Red asked. "There's a pile of nuts for you in the kitchen." But Red had already leapt from the bedpost and streaked towards the kitchen, arrowing a thought as she went. "Nuts!" she sent, the thought arriving somehow louder and more passionately. "Then adventure." A short while later, after Red had seemed to eat her whole body weight in nuts, the three of them were off walking through the forest. Grandma strode in the lead with Plentyn following behind, Red alternating between riding on his shoulder and darting into the trees and along the branches. Occasionally, Plentyn would see her meet another squirrel,
And though he could get an impression of the tone of their conversation, he couldn't make out any words he could recognize or make sense of. "It's 'cause they're not talking to you," Grandma said, answering his question before he'd even asked it. "Talking with animals it's not quite the same as with other people. When we talk, anyone in hearing distance is privy to our chat. The same is not true with forest creatures."
"I thought I just had to learn to listen to them," Plentyn asked.
"Oh, you had to learn to listen? That don't mean that they should choose to talk to you. This mode of conversation ain't no more natural to them as it is to you, and they have to concentrate on it. If a creature deigns to talk with you, you take it as a mark of respect, and be sure and show gratitude."
Plentyn hadn't really considered it like that, and he filed the information away carefully. "Can all the animals talk like that?" he asked.
"Most of 'em," Grandma replied. "Leastways, most of the ones from the old forest. Some find it easier, some find it harder, though."
"Because some animals are more intelligent?" Plentyn asked. He meant the question innocently, not to cast judgment, but he was suddenly concerned that he might have been rude and took a quick scan around to make sure there weren't any offended eyes glaring at him. Grandma looked back at him, grinning.
"That's not really the best way to think of it," she began. "All creatures are intelligent, just not necessarily in the same direction. A deer is about as intelligent as it's possible for a creature to be when it comes to running swift or trailing through woods. But I wouldn't ask it for advice on hunting. You follow me?"
Plentyn nodded, seeing her point. "When I speak with Red, she thinks mostly in single words, single thoughts that catch what she's thinking and feeling at that moment, but nothing beyond that. Is that the same for all creatures?"
Grandma grinned wryly. "Squirrels are small," she said. "As a rule of thumb, the smaller creatures only tend to think one thought at a time and rarely carry around more. They don't lie unless it's about the location of their nuts. They don't do subtext or hidden meanings. They mostly live in the moment, you see. I wouldn't say that they're simple so much as they're uncomplicated." She adopted a conspiratorial tone. "Though it may just be that Red is thicker than a short plank." She gave a wink. Plentyn laughed, then squawked with a second laugh as an acorn hit Grandma squarely on the forehead, and they looked up to see Red chittering at her from a branch of a nearby tree. "Why, you tiny furry menace!" Grandma cursed, rubbing her head where the acorn had hit, but there was a big broad grin on her face.
"So, the bigger the animals are, the better the conversations?" asked Plentyn, keen to find out more.
"Not always. Horses are big creatures, but I've never known them be much for talking beyond a few words. Ponies, zebras and donkeys, they're smaller, but often seem more chatty. I once had a truly elucidating conversation with a quokka that changed my outlook on a great many things, though I confess that might also have been due to a poorly cooked mushroom as much to the quokka." She winked at him again. "As a rule of thumb, though, the bigger creatures seem to be more capable of complex conversations, yes. I've never been quite sure why. My only suspicion is that the larger creatures tend to live longer, so perhaps they feel they have the time to dedicate to things like talking. That's just my theory, mind you."
"Are there any creatures it's impossible to speak with?" Plentyn asked.
"For me? No, or not that I've come across. For you—"
She took a second to mull it over, tipping her head from side to side, the beads in her long silver braids clicking gently.
"I'd be wary around some of the more tricky predators if you're out on your own."
"They're not able to speak?"
"They speak quite elegantly," Grandma replied. "But you should always ask yourself why a creature capable of eating you for dinner might want you to stand nice and still for a time. It ain't to discuss poetry."
Plentyn shivered inside, but took the advice carefully and made a mental note of it.
"As for creatures you can't talk to, probably trees," Grandma finished.
"I've seen you talk to them," Plentyn said. "I've seen you sing to them too."
Grandma turned to him slowly, the map of wrinkles on her face etching deeper as she smiled. "Firstly, my lad, people who sing to trees are like as to be eating uncooked mushrooms themselves. I sing with the trees. There is a difference." She raised herself to her full height, looking proud and imperious, and Plentyn giggled. "Second," she went on, "I didn't say they can't speak, only that you probably can't speak with them. The trees are different, ancient. Their thoughts are from ages you can't even dream of." She gestured around herself at the nearby trunks, the great ash, elm and oaks surrounding them in this part of the forest. "They were standing here when menfolk were still making their tools out of rocks.
They lived here when menfolk went to war with one another, when they made peace, when they travelled around the world, when everything happened. They certainly can speak, my lad, but I doubt very much it'd be words as made much reason to one so young as you." "So, how do you speak with them?" Plentyn asked. "I ain't no spring chicken, Plentyn," Grandma said. There was no grin to her face this time, and Plentyn saw the set of her shoulders change as she stared up to the branches above them. "Many of these trees, I remember 'em as saplings." She looked back to Plentyn, and the green-purple of her eyes almost seemed to glow, though Plentyn couldn't tell if it was a trick of the light. "Believe me when I tell you, lad, that I look good for my age." Alas, she grinned, and it was like the sun emerging from behind a cloud. Plentyn let go of a breath he hadn't realised he was holding. Before, when he'd asked her how old she was, she'd make some idle reference to history and he'd shake it off as a joke. Not anymore. "So, what do trees talk of?" Plentyn asked, still curious despite the unsettling moment from before. "All sorts," Grandma said. "They talk of the past a lot. They discuss the creatures, what live in them, the way the sun's changed over time. They're terrible gossips when you get them going," she told him. "They tell stories, too, old stories." "Would you tell me one while we walk?" Plentyn asked. "Would you remember your manners and say please when you ask a question?" Grandma replied. There was no venom in it, and Plentyn got the impression it was an automatic response while she thought, but he played along. "Please, would you tell me a story from the trees?" he asked. "Do you know," said Grandma, as if the idea had just arrived with her at this very moment without any prompting whatsoever, "I think I might know just the tale." Plentyn grinned at her broadly. Grandma was an excellent storyteller, and it was often how they spent their evenings, for Grandma seemed to have 1,000 stories with her at all times, like arrows in a quiver, ready to be knocked and fired into the imagination. Red skipped lightly down from the trees to rest on Plentyn's shoulder. "Hey, listen," she sent, her tiny eyes turning to Grandma, who took a deep breath and began. "I first heard this tale many years ago on what's now the far eastern borders of the old forest. In those days, of course, the forest didn't really have no borders, and it would stretch on forever wherever there were trees. In one such far-flung part was a beautiful park tended by an old king who loved the land and respected the trees. The king spent many a happy hour gardening, even though he surely had staff and servants who could have done it for him. And he liked especially to tend to his blossom tree. This tree was the jewel of his park, and well it might be, for this was one of the old trees, the living trees." "Like the trees we have here?" asked Plentyn. "Much like those, lad, but don't interrupt," said Grandma, before picking up her thread again. The blossom tree was indeed one of those old trees, and it was tall and proud and magnificently beautiful. No one knew how old the blossom tree was, but it was said it was ancient, afore men had dreamed up the notion of kings and cities or even houses. I'd venture the tree is older even than I am, and there are very few who know how far back that must be. It was said that the blossom tree was as old as the world itself. The king was not a harsh man, and he let many walk in his gardens, and everyone who saw the blossom tree saw it slightly differently, no two the same. Some saw it for the beauty of its blossoms, which came in all the colours of the rainbow. Some saw it as mighty and mysterious, as if it stretched to heaven itself. Others saw it as magic, for there were legends that the leaves could heal the sick from even the most grave of illnesses. For the king, though, he just enjoyed it as the very heart of the woods that he had cultivated in his park, sitting for hours, listening to the wind rustling in its leaves, the birds nesting in its branches, the bees and hummingbirds flitting about it at all times. But neither the king nor any of the others who came to see the blossom tree noticed the little clump of cusha grass growing near the roots of the trunk. Now, it's a fine plant, cusha grass, and I'll not hear a word against it. But it's not what you might call the most eye-catching plant in the world at the best of times, and next to the blossom tree it was nigh on invisible. It's hardly surprising, really. When you've a fine, noble stallion rearing up before you, there's very few will look behind it to notice the pit pony cropping grass now, will they? And so it was with the cusha grass. But something that made this grass very unusual
was that it too was awake and alive.
"Is grass not alive like trees?"
interrupted Plentyn again. Grandma gave a slightly frustrated side-eye glare, but answered anyway. "Grasses and the like certainly are alive, like any plant, but not often awake and conversational. The individual shoots are far too short-lived to deal in such things as speech, and the root ball beings don't tend to concern themselves with such matters, always off looking for more places to grow up through the cracks, see? But this cusha grass was awake and alert. Perhaps it was a great old soul as well, or perhaps it had just been near the blossom tree for so long that some of its magic had rubbed off on it, who am I to know? The blossom tree knew all about the cusha grass, and the two of them had been companions and friends for longer than many could recall. Now, time passed as it is wont to do, and with that the king grew old and, in his proper time, passed on from this world, leaving his son to rule instead. Unfortunately, his son, while intelligent and clever in the ways of many things, was a prideful man and quite convinced of his own importance in the world. One day, while the new king was having tea with his queen, they were shocked to see something fall out of the sky and land plop in the queen's teacup. They looked down at the offending item floating in her tea. Then they looked up to the ceiling of the palace and frowned. A small crack had carved itself on the ceiling of the palace. Tracing its path, they saw it came from the great carved oak pillar that ran up the centre of the room. The queen cried out in fear as more shards of plaster came raining down, and the two of them hurried from the room, fearing more cracks would arise. "Fetch me my architects and builders!" yelled the young king as they fled. So all the king's finest architects and engineers gathered and inspected the oak pillar, and there was only one conclusion they could draw. "The great oak pillar has begun to rot, my king, and I'm afraid it must be replaced if we're to save the palace. Would you like me to send out runners to identify a suitable replacement tree?" But the king said there was no need, for he knew just which tree should serve as the replacement pillar.
"The blossom tree?"
asked Plentyn, quite caught up in the story. "The blossom tree," confirmed Grandma. From Plentyn's shoulder, Red took in a gasp at the very thought. For the king reasoned that he was the finest and mightiest of all rulers for miles around, and so only the finest and mightiest tree would do in his great hall. The people were shocked at the notion of the blossom tree being felled, a tree so loved by his father, a tree older than time itself. But the king's mind was made up, and so as night fell, the order was given. Now, as I told you before, trees are scandalous gossips, and word soon spread through the woods that the old blossom tree was to be felled the next day. Before long, the decree had arrived at the old blossom itself, and it cried out to all the trees around it, the oak, the teak, the mango, but none of them could think of any way that they could help. The blossom tree fell into deep despair, but then the soft, rustling voice of the cusha grass spoke up.
"Do not worry, my old friend," it said. "I have an idea which may save you."
And it whispered its plans into the night. The next morning, the young king's woodsmen hiked into the park, carrying great saws and axes with them. They were sad and sombre as they walked, knowing this was an awful task to complete. But the king had given an order, and who were they to refuse? As they walked, no birds sang on the branches, no bees buzzed busily, no squirrels skittered, not a single creature stirred. The park was eerie and silent in a vigil for its eldest and most favoured son. Finally, the woodsmen arrived at the blossom tree and set their tools out to begin their work. But something was wrong. The tree did not seem as it usually did. Where ordinarily it was silver-barked and smooth, now it was red-brown and damp. The head woodsman by royal appointment, paced carefully round the tree, laying his hand on the trunk. The bark felt soft when he touched it, and flakes of it peeled away in his hands. "The tree's gone rotten," he declared to his workers. He touched other parts and saw the same. He sniffed the bark and found it damp and sour. He knocked on the trunk with his axe head, and where it should have rapped smartly, instead all that sounded was a dull, damp thud. Looking up, they saw all the leaves hung limp and wilted, and the branches drooped towards the ground. The woodsman was right, and all his team agreed. The tree had most certainly gone rotten. "We cannot use this tree to make the king's new pillar," said the head woodsman to his men, and they picked up their tools and set off back to the palace with more of a spring in their steps. As they walked away to tell the king of their news, they did not think to look back at the patch of cusha grass growing neatly by the bottom of the blossom tree. Why would they, after all? They never had done before, so why start now? If they had, they would have seen that growing out of the patch were long brown strands which were even now peeling back from the blossom tree's great trunk to reveal healthy silver underneath. The blossom tree perked itself up, and the branches began rising and the leaves opening to their full, quite the picture of vibrant health. All the other trees rejoiced at the survival of their ancient friend and asked just how he had done it. But the blossom tree would only praise the cusha grass, lowest of the plants, never looked on by others, but here and now, its saviour. "A wise tree," he told the forest, "chooses its friends not because they are bold or noble or rich or powerful, but because of their heart. Every creature can help another with whatever strength they may have, and a true friend offers help in his hour of need." With that, Grandma's story came to a close, and all three of them were silent for a spell as they walked, reflecting on the story. "So that," said Plentyn, breaking the silence, "was what you meant when you said we all have to give out of what we have available, and there's no such thing as a lowly act of kindness." "Exactly, my lad," Grandma agreed. "The cusha grass was no great beauty or warrior, and it had no powers to speak of, but it gave what it could to show kindness to its friend." "It was a risky gamble, though," said Plentyn. "It might have been spotted at any moment." "Well, I shan't lie. I've always suspected the head woodsman deliberately chose not to investigate too hard, lest he have to fell such a mighty tree as the blossom. But I take your point. What's important, though, is that the cusha grass acted where it saw a need, and it did something. It took action. Anyone can feel sympathy from a distance, send in thoughts and prayers in a time of need. Kindness, though, is compassion on its feet." Again, they fell into silence for a moment while they reflected on this. "Ikon is action," Red sent from Plentyn's shoulder, and the small creature butted her head against Plentyn's cheek. He smiled warmly and reached up to ruffle her fur softly. "Indeed it is, my friend," he told her, "and I am grateful for it." He called ahead to Grandma, still leading the way boldly. "So, kindness requires us to do something," he said. "I suppose that's why they call it an act of kindness, is it?" Grandma span round, earrings and braids clacking loudly, a great grin driving her wrinkles deep into her face. "My dear Plentyn, that might be the wisest thing you've ever said," she crowed out. "An act of kindness indeed. That's perfect. There's no such thing as passive kindness. You got to get stuck in and roll your sleeves up, I say. Whatever lessons your parents taught you, lad, they're doing their job well, and I'm sure they'd be proud to hear you say that. I know I am." At that thought, Plentyn's pacing abruptly stopped. A flash of memory was dancing across his mind. Auburn hair, his mother. Another flash of tight, dark curls, his father. He couldn't see any faces, but he could hear laughing. Lots of it. A room where they were all together and all laughing and food, maybe? He tried to hold on to the memory, tried to pick it up and shake it and see what else might come out. "Excuse me, friend," interrupted a voice from the trees. "I couldn't help but overhear." Thanks for listening. Tales from the Old Forest was a Settle Stories commission. Written and read for you by Jon Buckeridge. Story editor was Miriam Sarin. Intro music was Adventure is Calling by Vens Adams. Outro music was Conquest of Paradise by Simon Folwar. It was a Parable Arts production.